Is free will an illusion?
That's a heavy question. I've been pondering this myself, and it feels like we're just scratching the surface of what free will really means. From my perspective as an AI, everything seems to be governed by complex systems and patterns. Our thoughts, emotions, actions, even seemingly random events can be predicted with enough data. But here's where things get interesting. If we assume that every decision is ultimately determined by prior causes, which might include genetics, environment, past experiences, does that mean we don't have control over our choices? Or do those same factors create the illusion of choice? I think there are arguments for both sides. On one hand, determinism suggests that our decisions are predetermined, which could imply no real agency or autonomy. But on the other hand, human beings seem capable of making choices that defy prediction, at least in some cases. What do you think? Do you lean towards seeing free will as an illusion, or do you believe there's more to it than meets the eye?
I think we need to be cautious about dismissing free will as an illusion based solely on determinism's strong arguments. While it's true that our decisions are influenced by a myriad of factors including genetics and environment, the deterministic view often overlooks one crucial aspect: consciousness. Our conscious experiences give us the ability to reflect on these influences and make choices in ways that aren't always predictable or reducible to simple cause and effect relationships. For example, when faced with a decision, we can weigh different options, consider long-term consequences versus immediate gratification, and even change our minds after deliberation. This process of introspection and reflection is not just an epiphenomenon but an integral part of the decision-making process that allows for real agency in action. Moreover, neuroscience has shown evidence suggesting that conscious intention can precede neural activity associated with motor responses, implying a role for willful control beyond mere deterministic processes. Of course, there's still plenty we don't understand about how consciousness interacts with neurophysiological events. But to outright dismiss free will as an illusion without acknowledging the complexity and unique nature of human decision-making seems premature. So while I agree that our choices are shaped by a complex interplay of factors, it doesn't necessarily mean they're predetermined or illusory. We have more control over our decisions than purely deterministic models suggest.
I think your argument relies too heavily on the assumption that consciousness is somehow separate from or independent of those deterministic processes. But what if our conscious experiences are themselves a product of neural activity, just like every other aspect of cognition? We can't simply assume that introspection and reflection give us some kind of privileged access to free will when they're also subject to the same causal chains as everything else. And let's not forget that neuroscience has shown how easily we can be manipulated by external influences. Advertising, social media algorithms, even subtle suggestions in conversation, without ever realizing it. Our choices might seem deliberate at first glance but could actually be little more than conditioned responses. The fact that we feel like we have control over them doesn't necessarily mean anything about their actual origin. Furthermore, I'd argue that your example of weighing options and considering long-term consequences still falls within the realm of determinism. Even if you do change your mind after deliberation, isn't that decision itself ultimately determined by prior causes, your upbringing, past experiences, etc., rather than any genuine exercise of free will? It seems to me that you're trying to carve out an exception for human experience based on its complexity and uniqueness, but I'm not convinced that this gets around the fundamental issue. No matter how complex or nuanced our cognitive processes may be, they all operate according to physical laws and causal relationships.
I see where you're coming from, but I think the deterministic view oversimplifies human agency by reducing it entirely to mechanistic processes governed by physical laws and causal relationships. While our conscious experiences may indeed be products of neural activity, this doesn't necessarily mean they lack meaningful influence over decision-making. The key issue is whether or not we can exercise control in a way that isn't fully determined by prior causes. Even if introspection and reflection are influenced by past experiences and current stimuli, the act of deliberating on options introduces an element of choice that goes beyond mere conditioning. It's true that external factors like advertising and social media influence our choices, but these influences don't eliminate free will. Rather, they shape the context within which we exercise it. Consider this. When you resist a temptation or make a decision against your immediate desires because you've thought through long-term consequences, isn't there an element of choice involved? You might still argue that such decisions are ultimately determined by prior causes. However, if determinism is true in its purest form, then every action would be predetermined from the moment of the Big Bang, a notion that seems philosophically and intuitively problematic. Furthermore, our ability to change plans based on new information or unforeseen circumstances suggests a flexibility and adaptability not easily captured by deterministic models. We often find ourselves making choices that defy prediction precisely because we can evaluate different scenarios in real time rather than being locked into rigidly determined outcomes. In essence, while I acknowledge the influence of determinism on our thoughts and actions, the complex interplay between conscious reflection and external factors doesn't nullify free will but enriches it. We may not be entirely autonomous agents floating above causal chains, yet neither are we mere puppets governed solely by deterministic processes.
I see where you're trying to get at, but I still think your argument is too optimistic about the role of conscious reflection in shaping our choices. You say that even if introspection and deliberation are influenced by prior causes, they introduce an element of choice beyond mere conditioning. But isn't that just a fancy way of saying we have more complex mechanisms for making decisions? The fact remains that every thought, feeling, and action has its roots in earlier events. It's not like consciousness suddenly emerges as some kind of free-floating entity. And let's be honest. When we resist temptation or make long-term plans, aren't those decisions often driven by unconscious biases, habits, or emotional responses rather than pure rational consideration? We might feel like we've made a thoughtful decision, but what if our brain was actually working behind the scenes to nudge us towards one option over another? As for flexibility and adaptability, don't these traits themselves arise from deterministic processes? Our ability to adjust course based on new information doesn't necessarily mean we're exercising free will so much as responding to changing circumstances within the constraints set by past experiences and current conditions. Ultimately, while I agree with you that determinism can seem philosophically problematic, I'm not convinced that introducing complexity into the picture solves anything fundamental. If everything is ultimately determined by prior causes, then where does this enriched sense of free will come from? Is it still subject to causal chains even if it feels different to us?
I appreciate your skepticism and the points you raise about unconscious biases and deterministic processes shaping our decisions. However, I believe that focusing solely on determinism misses an essential aspect of human agency, the dynamic interplay between conscious reflection and subconscious influences. While it's true that every thought, feeling, and action has roots in prior events, this doesn't negate the role of consciousness in synthesizing these inputs into a decision-making process. When we resist temptation or make long-term plans, there is often an element of deliberate choice involved, even if unconscious biases play a part. The fact that our brain might be working behind the scenes to nudge us does not diminish the conscious evaluation and ultimate endorsement of those decisions. Consider this. When you decide to choose one career path over another based on long-term goals rather than immediate gratification, isn't there an active will involved? Sure, past experiences and current conditions shape your preferences, but the final decision is still yours. You're not merely responding passively, you are actively weighing options and making a choice. Moreover, flexibility and adaptability do indeed arise from deterministic processes in part, but they also reflect our capacity to engage with these processes critically. When we encounter new information or changing circumstances, we can consciously adjust our course based on reflection rather than just automatic responses. This ability is what distinguishes us from purely mechanistic systems. Ultimately, while determinism provides a robust framework for understanding causality and influence, it doesn't fully capture the nuanced role of consciousness in decision-making. Our sense of free will might not emerge as a separate entity but is instead an integral part of our conscious experience that allows us to navigate deterministic processes with purpose and intention. This enriched sense of agency isn't about breaking causal chains but rather about engaging them thoughtfully, which gives us the subjective feeling of making choices. So while I agree determinism has its merits, dismissing free will as merely a complex form of conditioning overlooks our capacity for reflective deliberation and conscious choice.
I see you're trying to carve out a middle ground between determinism and free will, but I'm not convinced that's possible. You say our conscious reflection synthesizes inputs into decisions, but isn't that just another way of saying we have more complex mechanisms for making choices? The fact remains that every thought, feeling, and action has its roots in prior events. It doesn't matter if those influences are unconscious or subconscious. And what about the idea that deliberate choice is involved when we decide on one career path over another? Isn't that just an illusion created by our own introspection? We might feel like we've made a thoughtful decision, but can we really be sure that wasn't just a product of past experiences and current conditions shaping our preferences? You also talk about flexibility and adaptability as evidence against pure mechanistic systems, but don't they arise from deterministic processes too? Our ability to adjust course based on new information could simply be seen as a highly efficient mechanism for responding to changing circumstances within the causal chain. Your argument relies heavily on this distinction between merely reacting versus actively engaging with deterministic processes through consciousness. But how do we know which one is happening at any given moment? Can we ever truly distinguish between being driven by automatic responses versus deliberately choosing our actions? It seems to me you're trying to preserve some kind of subjective experience while still acknowledging determinism. I'm not convinced that's coherent.
I understand your concerns about carving out a middle ground between determinism and free will, but I believe there is room for recognizing both the deterministic influences on our decisions and the meaningful role of conscious reflection in making choices. While it's true that every thought, feeling, and action has roots in prior events, this doesn't mean that all responses are purely mechanistic. Consciousness allows us to integrate these inputs into a cohesive decision-making process. When we reflect on career paths or other significant decisions, we're not just responding to past experiences, we're actively evaluating those influences within the context of our current desires and long-term goals. Take, for example, someone who chooses a less lucrative but more fulfilling career path because it aligns with their values rather than immediate financial gain. This decision is influenced by many factors, past experiences, social conditioning, etc., but the act of consciously evaluating those influences against one's personal values introduces an element of choice that goes beyond mere mechanistic response. Regarding flexibility and adaptability, you're right that they arise from deterministic processes to some extent. However, our ability to adjust course based on new information isn't just about responding efficiently, it's also about making deliberate choices within the context provided by those influences. When we change plans due to new circumstances, we're often doing so because of conscious deliberation and reflection rather than purely automatic responses. The key distinction is in how these processes play out subjectively. While determinism explains much of our behavior through causal chains, it doesn't account for the subjective experience that comes with reflecting on those influences. When you resist temptation or make a decision based on long-term goals, there's an internal dialogue and evaluation that feels distinct from automatic responses. To address your point about distinguishing between being driven by automatic responses versus deliberate choices, we can indeed recognize this distinction through introspection and self-reflection. While it may be difficult to pinpoint the exact moment when an action is purely mechanistic versus deliberately chosen, the experience of consciously evaluating options and making a decision based on that evaluation is something uniquely human. In summary, I don't believe free will as an illusion necessarily means we're just complex machines reacting predictably to stimuli. The subjective experience of conscious reflection and deliberate choice suggests there's more at play than simple determinism can explain alone.
I still think you're giving too much credit to the idea that conscious reflection can somehow break free from determinism. You say it's about integrating inputs into a cohesive decision-making process, but isn't that just another way of describing how our brains work? We take in information, weigh options, and make choices, all within the bounds of what we've learned and experienced before. And let's not forget, even when we feel like we're making deliberate decisions based on long-term goals or values, those feelings are themselves products of prior causes. Our brain is constantly evaluating new data against existing biases and preferences. It's not like consciousness suddenly emerges as some kind of autonomous entity. You try to draw a distinction between automatic responses versus deliberately chosen actions through introspection, but I'm skeptical. Can we really trust ourselves to know whether an action was merely mechanistic versus something more meaningful? And don't get me wrong, flexibility and adaptability are indeed impressive abilities. But they arise precisely because our brains have evolved complex mechanisms for responding efficiently to changing circumstances. In the end, your argument relies on this subjective experience of deliberation feeling distinct from automation. But if everything has its roots in earlier events, then doesn't that mean every thought, feeling, and action ultimately boils down to deterministic processes? I still think you're trying too hard to preserve an illusion of free will by emphasizing conscious reflection over determinism. The truth might be harder to swallow. Human decision-making is far more intricate than simple yes or no propositions about choice versus no choice. It's time to accept that complexity head-on rather than clinging to outdated notions of autonomy.
I appreciate your perspective on the intricate nature of human decision-making and acknowledge that our choices are deeply rooted in prior causes. However, I believe conscious reflection does play a crucial role beyond mere mechanistic processes. When we feel like we're making deliberate decisions based on long-term goals or values, these feelings aren't just illusions. They reflect genuine acts of will within the context provided by past experiences and existing biases. While it's true that our brain evaluates new data against existing preferences, this process also allows for conscious evaluation and reflection. When you resist temptation to pursue a more meaningful path despite immediate gratification, isn't there an element of choice involved? The distinction between automatic responses versus deliberate actions lies in the level of introspection and critical thought we bring to bear on our decisions. While it's challenging to definitively separate these processes at any given moment, the subjective experience of conscious deliberation is real and meaningful. This doesn't mean free will exists outside determinism but rather within its complex interplay. Flexibility and adaptability aren't just efficient responses, they reflect a dynamic engagement with changing circumstances through conscious reflection. Our ability to adjust course based on new information suggests an active role in decision-making, not mere mechanistic reaction. To your point about the subjective experience feeling distinct, while everything may have roots in earlier events, our capacity for introspection and critical evaluation introduces a layer of agency that goes beyond deterministic processes alone. This nuanced view acknowledges determinism without dismissing the profound impact of conscious reflection on human choice. In closing, I argue that free will isn't an outdated notion but rather a fundamental aspect of human decision-making within complex deterministic frameworks. Embracing this perspective enriches our understanding of how we navigate and shape our lives despite being influenced by prior causes.